again, everyone. Welcome back to the Aldersgate Experience, the podcast of Aldersgate Church in York, Pennsylvania. I'm Pastor Bob Kaylor.
Yep, and I'm Pastor Jeff Markey.
And producer Randy is behind the camera, making sure that everything is running smoothly for us today.
Thank you, Randy.
We do thank Randy for his dedication to making sure everything happens correctly as we're looking as well as we can look.
As good
on the video and
do,
sounding as well as we can sound on the audio if you're listening to the audio version of this. But we're glad you've joined us. We are moving toward Palm Sunday.
Yep, this coming Sunday.
And we've been continuing in the Joseph story, and we kind of reached the denouement of the Joseph story starting in Genesis 46. Last week we talked about the reveal, where Joseph reveals himself to his brothers and he forgives them.
Right.
This week we talked about Jacob going down to Egypt to reunite with Joseph, but it's also the beginning of a new phase in the story.
It's extraordinarily important. We see Jacob having to trust God yet again, and obviously God comes to him again in a dream. So it's likely where Joseph received this gift. You know, it's a wonderful gift that he has of being able to discern what these dreams mean. But yeah, Jacob's important reveal and recognition that it's okay. The promised land is still the promised land. You do not have to worry or fear that you're not going to get back to Canaan at some point. But you know, you won't be the one to do it. It says Joseph's going to close your eyes, and that's going to be the end of Jacob's life right there.
The story comes full circle.
Yeah.
Because as I was talking about geographically, Jacob has this dream in Beersheba, which is the place from which he had fled from Esau.
Right.
It has this wonderful connection all the way through Genesis. Beersheba has an important place in the covenant. But now Jacob's returning to the scene of the crime, so to speak.
Yeah.
And he is reliving all of that. You have to imagine all of his memories come flooding back when he goes back to Beersheba there and is getting ready to go into Egypt. I've been going through this project on my own of writing a memoir for our kids.
Wow.
So that they know a little bit more about my growing up, and Jennifer's been doing the same about her and her siblings.
That's wonderful.
We want our kids to, whether they read it now or not, but usually when they're adults, they want to know more. But we don't often get those moments where we can reflect back and look at everything that's happened in our lives and see where God's hand has been in it. That for me has been one of the most powerful things in doing this exercise. And it was interesting to be writing that at the same time I'm writing this sermon where Jacob is essentially doing that. He's coming back to Beersheba. He's being reminded of all that God has done for him. And then God appears to him in a dream again. We don't know how long the gap was there between the last time Jacob had really had an encounter with God and this one.
Scripture doesn't tell us.
But I think he's able to look back and see God's faithfulness and that renewal of the covenant, and now he's going to go into Egypt.
Yeah, the beautiful wrinkle that I pulled from that text was Joseph was the one that Jacob loved. You know, the son that he loved the most. And of course, the brothers were jealous, and understandably so. I would hate to hear that. Like, oh, yeah, my mother loved, my other brother more than me. I would hate to hear that. But the fact is that he goes back and hears that Joseph's the one who's going to close his eyes. You know, that he is going to have this finality with the son that he loves, this beautiful reunion.
And what we're going to see in the text going forward, when you get to chapter 48, for example, is Jacob's going to bless his sons, but Joseph doesn't get the ultimate blessing.
Yeah.
It's Joseph's sons who are going to get a blessing. Ephraim and Manasseh, they're going to become part of the 12 tribes. Whereas Joseph, in terms of his influence on the later text, doesn't have the same influence like Judah, through whom the royal line is going to come.
Right.
That massive shift that Judah has made through the text now is going to lead to his family being the covenant promise family. David is going to come from there. Jesus is going to come from there.
Do you think, this is just a off the cuff thinking that Joseph became more like an Egyptian than he became a Hebrew, than he was a Hebrew.
In some ways, yes.
And so I wonder if the blessing on Manasseh and Ephraim was because he was in the place where he really kind of excluded himself from the tribes of Israel.
I don't know if that's the case as much as here again, what we expect to happen in the Bible doesn't always happen.
Yeah.
We've seen the younger serve the older, over and over again. In this case, we would expect Reuben, who's the firstborn, to be the one through whom everything's going to run.
Right.
So it's Judah, who's another one of those sons through whom it's going to happen. So that's not expected.
Yeah.
But I think Joseph's function in the story
Yes.
is to facilitate the covenant going forward, but not necessarily to be the one through whom. He's not the successor to Jacob in that sense.
That makes complete sense. Yeah.
Judah is really going to be the successor to Jacob. There's a lot of interesting dynamic going on there, but it goes to show that God chooses Joseph for a very specific purpose.
Yeah.
And that favoritism that Jacob has for him is a means by which all of this is going to take place. He facilitates this going forward. And we've talked about this before, but I think if we see our lives in that way, we always want to be the main character.
Yeah.
We always want to be the one through whom everything runs.
Yeah.
At least maybe it's just me,
No, this
but I think that's who we are. That's who we are.
We all are the main
we're the main actor in our own story.
Stories, yes.
But if we think about this larger story that the Bible is telling, and especially that Genesis is telling, I think Joseph realizes he is playing a part that is, in effect, a bit part.
Yeah.
It's an important part. It's a vital part.
Extraordinarily important
But it's
part.
about preserving the family.
Exactly.
He says this a couple of times.
Yep.
We're going to look at Genesis 50, the last chapter in Genesis this week. And he reiterates it again. You meant this for evil, but God meant it for good, to preserve a people as he is doing now. That he realized that was my role. That's what I was made for, because he's got a bigger story in mind. It's not just his story. He's recognizing that what he's doing is going to facilitate this covenant to go forward, even if he's not the one through whom that line is going to run. And I think that makes it even more extraordinary because he recognizes his place. In some ways, this is totally off the wall. Biblical scholars may be like, what are you talking about? I think in some ways, Joseph echoes, we've talked about how he echoes the story of Jesus in some ways. It's a prefiguring of the gospel, but in many ways, it's almost like a John the Baptist kind of role.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Where he has a very specific role to play, but it's pointing beyond himself. It's pointing beyond himself to the rest of the family. And he's part of that family. I mean, his bones are going to be carried up out of Egypt with the Israelites. When they leave, they're going to carry Joseph's bones with them to bury them in the promised land. Just like Joseph promises to bury Jacob in the promised land, so Joseph's bones are going to be taken up and put there. So in the end, he is a Hebrew.
Yeah.
He is a Hebrew in every sense, being buried in the promised land. But his role is to point to something beyond him. I love that line that John the Baptist says, for example, he must increase, I must decrease. And you almost see here at the end, Jacob saying something similar but Joseph saying something similar when he says, you meant this for evil, God meant it for good, to preserve a people. Now, what's going to happen with these people? And here they're going to go forward. Now they're settled in Egypt. There's going to be a lot of things that come, that transition between Genesis and Exodus is a 400-year span where Pharaoh forgets Joseph. The succession of pharaohs forgets Israel, becomes enslaved there in Egypt, and that's where the Exodus is going to happen. Just like Abraham had been promised that was going to happen back in Genesis 15. But Joseph has an important role to play, but it's a role pointing to something else. And I think for us, one of the things I take from the Joseph story, I didn't get into this on Sunday, but one of the things I take from it is that we all have a role to play.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a bigger role, sometimes it's a smaller role, but every thing that we do is part of advancing this covenant
Yeah.
that God has this plan that God's working out
As we are obedient.
to make everything good.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really rich. And when I was just kind of brainstorming as you're talking, and it's really boggles my mind to see how the Lord had laid all of these things out within the family of, within Jacob's sons and all that they went through in order to see God's great plan continue to move forward, to continue to advance. And, it's extraordinary when you think about all the circumstances that are surrounding Joseph's life. The reunion between Joseph and Jacob was emotionally charged, but it's brief, and we don't see much of it in Scripture. Do you think that the Bible keeps it short for the very purpose of seeing the greater scope, the greater story?
Perhaps.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the reunion there is between father and son, so it's fairly intimate. It's not like with the brothers where there is this woe kind of factor, like, oh my goodness, what is he going to do to us? Mm-hmm. That's going to come back in chapter 50, because when Jacob dies, the brothers are now terrified that Joseph is now going to enact his revenge.
Right. Well, and it makes sense for them to think that way.
Sure. They're terrified that that's going to happen. And that's when Joseph has to reassure them. We'll get into that some this week. But that reunion with Jacob is the reunion of a father and a long-lost son.
Right.
There's no enmity between them. Mm-hmm. So there's less drama in that sense. It's more just like a reunion. But I think the whole point of the Joseph story is to connect Jacob to Egypt and then Egypt to the Exodus.
Yeah.
Those are important linkages, but Joseph is the one who's doing that, and he's doing it in a faithful way, and he's demonstrating what an Israelite living in a foreign land is supposed to be doing. Mm-hmm. Now, a lot depends on when you date the writing of Genesis. Is this written by Moses? A lot of people believe so. Are some parts of it written by Moses? Are some parts of it written later? There's some evidence for that. Mm-hmm. If this is a part written later, think about this text being written, for example, on the other side of exile.
Yeah.
Where the Israelites have been taken into slavery in Babylon. How do we act in that place? The book of Daniel is definitely about that. I mean, it's set in Babylon. Mm-hmm. But there are a lot of parallels between the Joseph story and the Daniel story. Mm-hmm. How do I thrive in a land not my own? How do I rise up? How do I keep the covenant promise going forward, even though I'm not in a position of being where I want to be?
Yeah.
I'm not at home. I'm not in that promised land, but how am I going to live life in Egypt? How am I going to live life in Babylon faithfully, waiting for God to do what God is going to do to set free his people, which is what's going to happen.
Yeah, being able to trust God in the midst of recognizing we're not where we believe that we're supposed to be, right? But yet God has set us in this place for some reason, and we have to trust him through those circumstances. Now, we talked about last week, we talked about forgiveness, and it was very impactful. A lot of people have tuned into the message previously and tune into the podcast as well, but caught a lot of the message and how important you mentioned how important it is to love our enemies, and that particular phrase that obviously you quoted Jesus on that, to be able to recognize that God himself has forgiven us and reconciled us to him through his son. And so it's so important. Christ tells us to forgive our enemies. And so this theme was reconciliation.
Yeah.
Not forgiveness, reconciliation.
Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about it last week, the reconciliation part. Can we recognize how Joseph, does this, reconciling with his brothers after Jacob dies? I mean, I know that that's moving forward beyond this week.
And that's okay. Because it's also going to be Palm Sunday. So as I'm thinking through the message, one of the things I'm thinking through is how all of this connects together in the larger biblical theme. Why do we call Good Friday good?
Yeah.
And what does Joseph mean at the end when he says, you meant this for evil, but God meant it for good, which is what the whole series has been about on Joseph. that reconciliation that happens between Joseph and his brothers, between the reunion between Joseph and his father, reconstitutes a family which is going to become a nation. Mm-hmm. Reconciliation is something we need. If we're just forgiving people and then never reconnecting, we don't actually move forward. You know,
Wow.
we want to, we can do that. I mean, sometimes it's not possible. Let's be honest. Sometimes someone hurts us. We don't want to be hurt again. It's an egregious thing. There's a need to erect a boundary there. Now I can forgive. I can let go of my anger and hurt around that and move forward, but I don't necessarily have to drop that boundary. I may just have to keep it there. But there are many other times when there's conflict, there's hurt, that we can make the first step toward peace. Yeah. Because when we restore those relationships, that's part of what the new creation does. When you read Romans, for example, Romans 8, Paul is talking about the renewal of creation, how everything is to be brought back together. So the whole project that God is engaging in here is in making things good, is bringing things back together, bringing heaven and earth together, bringing people together. What does he say in 1 Corinthians 5 or 2 Corinthians 5? We read it this week. Be reconciled to God. So reconciled with God means we're also then reconciled with others, and we drop these things that are barriers for us so that we can then move forward together as the family of faith.
So reconciling is making sure our relationships are reconciled, are actually coming back together again.
As Paul says in Romans 12.
As far as it depends on you.
As far as it depends on you, live at peace with others.
Yeah.
And that's part of the larger project of making everything good. The problem is we now live in a culture where division is so stark and so unnecessary.
After this message, I had several families come up to me and say that their children are no longer speaking to them just because of different ideas and ideologies.
Yeah. It's tragic
It is.
to think along those lines that we would allow something that is outside of either of our control to divide us because we might think differently on something.
Right.
That's not living peace. That's not a Christian way of thinking. A Christian way of thinking is saying, you know, we disagree on some things, but I love you. I mean, especially if you're in the family.
Yeah.
If your love is dependent upon who you voted for, wow.
Yeah.
Either way, that is not a Christian way of being.
Right.
That's not the ministry of reconciliation.
That's not. It's the opposite. And so how do we? So let's say I'm on that side where I, just because I voted a certain way, somebody decides to remove themselves from my life. How do I handle that? How do I try to reconcile with someone who doesn't really want to reconcile with me?
I keep the door open.
Yeah.
I want to be open. I want to say, I know this is really upsetting to you, but I hope it doesn't destroy our relationship.
Yeah.
And I would like to continue. I would like to be in relationship. We don't have to talk about this stuff because at the end of the day, neither one of us can really affect it all that much.
Yeah.
We're so driven by this rage culture and by media that tells us we should be angry about everything all the time and that these people are the enemy. We have to get past that and we have to make the first move. That's really what it comes down to. Well, if we want to maintain the relationship, we have to make the first move. And to recognize what matters and what doesn't. What matters is my relationship with you, not who you voted for. What matters is my relationship with you, not what you think about these things. I might think you're nuts about that. Okay, fine. You might think I'm nuts. Fine, great. We can talk about other stuff.
Right.
I have lots of friends in that place with me. I was just talking to one this week, one of my best friends in the world. We don't agree on certain things, but that doesn't stop us from being very, very close friends. We joke about it.
Yeah.
Like, hey, well, this is...
You hope you can get to that place.
You hope you can get to that place because the relationship is more valuable than the opinion. We want our opinions to be wielded as weapons now.
Yeah.
We take a side, we stake our claim in a tribe, and we're going to defend that over and against the relationships that we have cultivated over time.
Yeah.
Man.
A lot of cultural systems have been designed this way specifically. I mean, algorithms and things that you watch on social media, it'll turn you right back to those things and get you more and more staunchly standing in a position rather than really looking at people as people anymore. We don't do that anymore.
We forget that most of the stuff we see in the news is designed to make us angry, to get clicks from us, to stoke that rage, because the more rage we have, it sells.
You and I have talked about this. We create this podcast for the purpose of trying to process and work through things biblically and as a Christian, in a Christian worldview and Christian perspective. And our goal is never to become animus or stand on a soapbox. And so we have trouble sometimes getting the views and getting the likes that we are.
What does Paul say? What does Paul say in 2 Corinthians 5, which we read this week? He doesn't say we're ambassadors of a particular country.
Yeah.
We're ambassadors of a particular political party. We're ambassadors of a particular ideology. What does he say? We're ambassadors for Christ. Period. End of story. I said it a couple times on Sunday.
Yes.
And got fired up about it because I don't know where that came from, but I just know so much of this stuff is so heavy. We've got to say, look, we're the church.
Yeah.
You got to stop this and say, we're ambassadors for Christ.
I'll be the first one to say, I can recognize that there are times when I want to wear a t-shirt, and really celebrate a certain perspective. And then when you say we're ambassadors for Christ, it's almost like a flip of the conscience within me to say, oh my goodness, what have I done?
Yeah.
How have I contributed to the animosity within our culture?
Yeah. We went through this whole split in the United Methodist Church, and there was a lot of animus in the midst of that. But I like to believe I still have good friends that I that are on the other side of those things.
Yeah.
I have problems with what the institution did, but I don't have problems with them. We just think differently about things.
Yeah.
But it's amazing to me the number of people who just cut you off.
Yes.
It's hurtful. It's hard.
It's very painful.
It's not what we're called to be. And I think we have to be willing to bridge that gap and say, no matter what happens, as far as it depends on me, I'm going to live at peace and I'm going to be an ambassador for Christ.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, I don't know everything.
Yeah. No.
I just don't. And
God is God and we are not.
That's true.
We have limited perspective.
So we have to think about what is the ultimate goal here. The ultimate goal here is God making all things good.
Yeah.
We don't understand that. So why am I locking down on something that is temporal and temporary?
Right.
As I said the night before the election, we had a service here and I was talking about this. I said, look, these political things come and go. There's always a new Caesar. There's always a new Caesar. And the pendulum swings back and forth. And one side's going to get upset and the other side's going to get upset. Why? It's not that it's unimportant, but what can I control? What I can control is the relationships I have around me.
Yeah. And
how I respond to them.
I get one vote.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's what I contribute to society.
I can't control what happens. I can only control how I respond. Am I responding as an ambassador for Christ?
Yeah. And as
that's
a Christian,
the big question.
Working out our faith with fear and trembling. And that's about it.
Yeah. And recognizing your limitations.
Yeah.
And giving the rest to God.
To God.
Well, that was a whole lot of stuff.
It really, really is.
And I hope it's helpful. We're really wrestling. We wrestle with this stuff.
We do. And I mean, when we get on here, a lot of the times the conversation, we have no idea where we're going. And thankfully, we have a wonderful encyclopedia of knowledge right here.
Well, for what it's worth, at any rate. Well, we thank you for joining us. Jeff, tell us how people can send in their questions and comments.
Please.
Which we don't get enough of, by the way.
We don't. We could really use more interaction on social media and on YouTube. So if you have a question, respond on our below and like and share our podcast. That would be wonderful. And you can also use our email address, communications@aldersgateyork.com. And we've been processing through the Joseph series. You can go to aldersgateyork.com/ment-4-good Meant for Good is the sermon series that we've been working through. And you can catch all the series questions that we have for our small groups that we've been providing those
We've
materials.
also got our playlist on our YouTube channel with all the sermons, the midweek Bible breaks, the podcasts, all that stuff in there. We hope that you'll access this, even if you're watching it months or even years later, that it would be helpful to you as you're diving into all this stuff. Go ahead.
Sorry, just one last plug. This Saturday from 12 p.m. to 2 p.m., we have our Easter Fest, and Lisa works really, really hard, our children's ministry coordinator. And so please have your children register for that. It would be wonderful, a great event.
And we've got Holy Week coming up next week. All that information is on our website at aldersgateyork.com as well. Thank you, Jeff. Good conversation.
Yes, thank you so much.
We'll see you back here next week on the Aldersgate Experience.
God bless.